In the quiet countryside of 1834 Virginia, surrounded by whispering woods and farmland, the Sullivan family estate sat like any other weather-beaten, dignified, and cloaked in the customs of Southern gentility to neighbors and passing travelers. The Sullivan home was a symbol of stability and religious propriety, its whitewashed exterior and blooming gardens concealing what lay below. And the truth, however, unraveled when local authorities, driven by a growing unease over a string of child disappearances, turned their attention toward the Sullivan property. It was not a raid, not even a fully authorized search, but a cautious inquiry that cracked open one of the most grotesque discoveries in antebellum American history. In the basement of that seemingly normal home, behind a hidden wooden hatch, under rotting floorboards, lawmen uncovered a makeshift dungeon. Within it, 47 children, gaunt, bruised, and chained, sat in silence. The kind of silence that screams with trauma. The room was damp and poorly ventilated, its stone walls slick with condensation. A single, sooty lantern offered the only light, casting grotesque shadows across the skeletal frames of its young prisoners. They were arranged in a way that blurred individuality. No names, no clothes, to distinguish rank or role, just pale, wide-eyed faces marked with filth and fear. The air was thick with the stench of human waste, rotting straw, and a sourness that clung to the skin. Some of the children sat limp against the wall, too weak to rise, while others, startled by the sudden arrival of strangers, began to cry or mumble incoherently. Chains clinked with every movement, fastened tightly around their ankles and embedded into the walls or floor, leaving little room for motion. Many bore the raw, infected wounds of prolonged restraint. Their condition was a chilling testament to how long they had been down there. Months for some, so years for others. The officers on the scene, hardened men accustomed to the brutality of slave patrols and debtor jails, found themselves frozen and placed their eyes darting across the figures as if trying to make sense of a waking nightmare. One deputy, reportedly unable to contain himself, vomited in the corner. Another collapsed to his knees and began to pray. They had not expected this. The rumors had hinted at something sinister, yes, but nothing this organized, this deliberate. These were not wild orphans corralled in desperation. They were captives, selected and stored like broken toys, with a system of cruelty as calculated as it was hidden. Outside, the Sullivan family presented a portrait of composure, though it began to unravel quickly. William Sullivan, the patriarch, denied knowledge of the basement entirely, claiming it had been sealed since before the family moved in. His wife, Margaret, clutched a Bible and wept, but refused to allow herself to be questioned alone. Their grown sons remained silent, their expressions hard to read, their hands to clean. The townspeople, once deferential and admiring of the Sullivans' wealth and Sunday devotion, gathered in clusters just beyond the property line, whispering theories that had long been spoken only in hushed tones. The family had always kept to themselves. The servants changed often. Children who wandered near the property sometimes never came back, but no one had wanted to believe anything that might disturb the order of their close-knit, reputation-bound society. What had triggered the initial search was the disappearance of a local orphan named Caleb, whose few remaining relatives insisted he'd been seen near the Sullivan fields days before he vanished. The sheriff, under pressure from grieving families and an unusually vocal church group, had agreed to investigate, though he doubted such an esteemed household could be involved. What he found instead was a tightly controlled estate where the family oversaw every aspect of the land, rarely hired help for interior work, and kept their cellar locked under a rusting iron grate. It was a low moan barely audible that led a deputy to peel back a section of floorboards beneath a disused rug in the storage room. The trapdoor gave way with effort, revealing the darkness below and the faint, unmistakable scent of rot and sweat. Reports indicate that the children ranged from as young as 4 to as old as 17, though their physical conditions made age difficult to determine. Most were unable to speak properly, their vocabulary atrophied, their speech slurred or reduced to animalistic muttering. Some showed signs of physical and cognitive disability, whether from congenital issues or long-term trauma. A few were lucid enough to give partial names, bits of memories, and pieces of how they ended up there. Some claimed they were taken while walking home from school. Others had no memory of their lives before the basement. One boy, about 10 years old, stared blankly at a deputy and asked if he was the new master, before crawling backward into a corner and closing his eyes as if to disappear. Medical examination by the town doctor revealed long-term signs of starvation, rickets, bruising, and lacerations on nearly all of the children. Some bore old scars consistent with whipping or burn marks. Malnourishment had shrunk their growth, making it impossible to determine how long each had been kept. There were signs of hierarchy even among the captives. Certain children were unchained during the day to assist in feeding the others or cleaning the chamber under supervision, indicating a chillingly structured routine imposed from above. Basement held no toys, no blankets, no semblance of comfortingly rusted chains, rotting straw, a few buckets, and scattered bones of small animals, possibly fed to the children or allowed in through drainage cracks in the wall. News of the discovery spread through the county like a virus. Preachers called it the work of the devil, while abolitionists seized on the incident to further their case against the institutional acceptance of human bondage in the South. Though the children were white, their treatment mirrored the horrific conditions known to exist on certain slave plantations, a parallel that many were quick to deny or downplay. The social elite, many of whom had dined with the Sullivans or sat beside them in pews, recoiled in public but whispered behind closed doors. The scandal threatened to topple more than a single family. It threatened the very myth of civility, upon which the community had built its identity. Even more unsettling were the journals, found in a locked trunk in the family study. Though much was illegible, several entries suggested that the Sullivans saw their actions as a kind of divine experiment tracing children without the sins of the outside world, purifying them through hardship, breaking their spirits to build something closer to obedience. Some entries included biblical verses, alongside twisted interpretations, describing the children as lambs in need of slaughtered pride, vessels to be emptied before being filled anew. Whether this was madness, religious extremism, or simply cruelty, veiled in Scripture, no consensus could be reached. The horror of the scene eclipsed interpretation. It simply was, in all its raw, stomach-churning reality. To the community of rural Virginia in 1834, the Sullivan family embodied everything that was good, decent, and respectable. Their name was etched into the ledgers of the local church, their pew always occupied on Sundays, their donations to the town's charities generous, and their manners unfailingly courteous. The patriarch, William Sullivan, was known for his oratory in church, often reciting scripture with a fervor that stirred the hearts of listeners. Margaret Sullivan, his wife, hosted tea gatherings and was praised for her hospitality and devotion to Christian womanhood. Her children, dressed in fine linen and educated by private tutors, were seen as polite, well-groomed, and properly reserved. The house itself was large but not gaudy. Surrounded by trimmed hedges and blooming flowers, the American dream as envisioned by plantation-era values. But beneath that crafted image of righteousness lay something so incongruent, so deeply malevolent. It defied all logic and exposed the fragility of moral facades. The Sullivans were masterful at perception management. Their outward piety became a shield against suspicion. In an era where public reputation often mattered more than personal integrity, the family leaned into religious posturing with precision. William Sullivan quoted scripture liberally in both business and social dealings, invoking divine providence as justification for his authority and decisions. His household was run with militaristic discipline cloaked in the language of godliness. Children were to be seen, not heard. Servants were rotated frequently. Doors within the house were kept locked, always explained away as part of preserving order or safeguarding valuables. They discouraged visitors from lingering too long, especially in the basement or cellar areas, which were said to be structurally unsound and therefore dangerous. Despite their aloofness, the Sullivans managed to be well-liked, or at least well-regarded. Their generosity was strategic, timed around major church holidays or civic projects. They contributed heavily to the construction of a new chapel annex and were known to pay the funeral costs of destitute townsfolk, earning them praise in local sermons and letters. Margaret frequently hosted sewing circles that doubled as informal prayer meetings, where she would speak of sin, redemption, and the need for strict upbringing. Other mothers would nod, some perhaps uncomfortable, but unwilling to challenge her authority. The aura of moral superiority they exuded was reinforced at every turn, not by warmth, but by the cold clarity of social hierarchy. Their wealth, their land, and their religiosity created an unspoken immunity to suspicion. It was this immunity that allowed them to carry out what they did for so long. The children hidden in the basement were not only physically imprisoned, but erased from societal awareness. Some were runaways. Others were orphans or children of the poor, whose disappearances were written off as misadventure or misfortune. A few were suspected to be purchased quietly from itinerant traders. A transaction that blurred the line between slavery and exploitation, between commerce and evil. In a town where asking too many questions could mark you as troublesome, many chose to remain silent, even if they suspected that the Sullivans' goodness was only skin-deep. What made the deception so insidious is how effectively it used the language of morality to mask monstrosity. The family Bible, later seized during investigation, contained handwritten notes in the margins next to passages about discipline, obedience, and suffering. These annotations twisted verses into justifications for control and punishment. Wrote of refining the soul through trial and submitting the flesh to divine chastisement. The tone was clinical, devoid of compassion, focused on order, purity, and hierarchy. There was no remorse, only rationalization. These weren't aberrations in belief, they were systematic distortions, designed to reinforce the family's dominion over the hidden children while still maintaining the illusion of holiness in the public eye. The local church bore some indirect complicity, though few were willing to admit it. Clergy members had long praised the Sullivans for their commitment to Scripture and their contributions to Christian society. Sermons often mentioned the family as paragons of virtue. When whispers began to circulate about strange sounds or locked doors, these concerns were often brought to pastors instead of sheriffs. And the pastors, believing in the sanctity of reputation and fearing scandal, urged patience, prayer, and discretion. It wasn't until the bodies were uncovered living, breathing testaments to a truth too grotesque to deny, that the moral authority of the Sullivans collapsed. Even then, some townsfolk found it difficult to reconcile what they had believed. For years, with the reality in front of them, the same man who had read psalms aloud with such conviction had kept children chained in darkness. The same woman who had spoken of Jesus' mercy had allowed toddlers to starve beneath her parlor floor. How could both be true? The dissonance fractured the community's trust in appearances, unraveling their belief that goodness could be measured by church attendance, polished shoes, or the occasional charitable act. In many ways, the Sullivan case revealed the dangers of moral absolutism and blind deference to hierarchy. Their respectability was armor, and their piety a weapon. They knew that in their society, accusations against the rich and holy were harder to believe and harder still to act upon. The system favored them not just because of wealth, but because they understood how to perform virtue convincingly. Their downfall was not a result of guilt or confession, but of external pressure and a single misstep, the disappearance of a child, who had people willing to keep looking. Witnesses later recalled moments that, in hindsight, had seemed strange. The way William would avoid shaking hands with children, the sudden disappearance of certain servants, the screams heard one summer night, quickly dismissed as foxes or owls. All the signs had been there, scattered like puzzle pieces ignored, out of politeness or fear. It was not just the Sullivans who had failed. The town itself had chosen comfort over confrontation, appearances over inquiry. In elevating the family to untouchable status, they had inadvertently created a sanctuary. For horror, the tragedy left scars deeper than the physical wounds of the rescued children. It cast doubt on the very metrics by which the community judged righteousness. Faith had been twisted, charity corrupted, and reputation used as a mask for unimaginable cruelty.
The community was left to grapple with the unsettling truth that
evil, could look very much like virtue, speak in scripture, kneel at the altar, and smile with perfect civility. The investigation into the Sullivan family's estate began not with a grand inquiry but with the slow, persistent accumulation of unease. Several children had vanished over the course of 3 years, disappearances spread out far enough in time and distance that no single case raised significant alarm, but close enough to suggest a pattern if anyone cared to connect the dots. Most of the missing were children of laborers, vagrants, or widows, those whose absence stirred only whispers in back alleys and candlelit kitchens. Caleb Turner, the orphan whose vanishing would ignite the chain of events, was the first child, whose loss generated more than a passing notice. A quiet boy with sandy hair and nervous eyes, Caleb had been taken in by an elderly uncle who swore he'd last seen him walking near the edge of Sullivan property, chasing a stray dog. That statement, seemingly harmless, fell into the hands of a deputy who had grown weary of the silence that surrounded these disappearances. His name was Eli Warner, a man neither ambitious nor reckless, but someone who had developed an uncomfortable sense that the answers no one wanted to face were hiding behind the gates of the most respected family in the county. Eli began discreetly, speaking to townspeople, especially those who lived near the Sullivans. At first, all he got were platitudes: how generous the family was, how righteous, how private. But pressed gently, a few people confessed to unease. A girl who once delivered eggs to the estate said she wasn't allowed past the porch. A handyman who fixed the barn roof remembered seeing a boy's face in a cellar window, gone in a blink. The local blacksmith recalled being paid to reinforce basement locks and finding the request strange for a family not known to store valuables underground. None of it was evidence, but it formed a tapestry of suspicion, woven together with threads of silence and fear. Eli, with growing conviction, brought his findings to Sheriff Abraham Collier, a man old enough to distrust change but sharp enough to read the deeper truths in people's faces. Though reluctant, Collier agreed to a search, not a raid, but a polite inspection framed as a matter of safety after reports of property damage near the estate. When they arrived at the Sullivan estate, they were met with practiced charm. William Sullivan greeted them calmly, offering cider and cool words about lawmen doing their duty. He consented to a walkthrough but denied access to the cellar, citing flood damage and rot. That alone should have been grounds for suspicion. But without a warrant, Collier hesitated. It was Eli who noticed something out of place. A rug shifted awkwardly in the main storage room, revealing a seam in the floorboards that didn't align with the rest of the pattern. With quiet urgency, he peeled it back and uncovered a rusted iron ring bolted to a hatch. Sullivan, caught in the act of inventing another excuse, stammered. The air changed. Collier stepped forward, gun drawn now, voice stern. With tools from the barn, they pried open the hatch and descended into darkness. The first thing they noticed was the smell, a suffocating mixture of waste, mold, and decay. The flickering lanterns revealed rows of small, slumped figures, chained and silent. The silence itself was unnatural. Cries, no pleading, only the dull clinking of chains as the children slowly turned toward the light. The officers froze. Eli swore under his breath. Collier, hardened by decades of witnessing human cruelty, gripped the wall for balance. It was not just the number of children, 47 in total, but the state they were in. Bones visible through skin, eyes wide and sunken, lips cracked, and feet bound so tightly that some had grown misshapen. Each child was a living monument. To suffering, a portrait of innocence brutalized into submission. The initial response was chaos. Word spread through the town in hours. By the next morning, a crowd had gathered near the estate, kept at bay by hastily deputized locals. Church bells rang, not in celebration, but in alarm. Townswomen wept openly. Men cursed through clenched jaws. The mayor arrived in a rush, his face pale, his authority crumbling beneath the weight of what had been unearthed. Physicians and volunteers scrambled to care for the children, many of whom had to be carried out one by one. Some were too weak to stand, others too frightened to speak. A few screamed at any touch, convinced they were about to be punished again. It was clear this had not been a recent atrocity. It had been in place for years, maintained with methodical cruelty. Inside the basement, officers documented everything. Chains bolted into stone, makeshift feeding troughs, stained walls, and a crude ledger with markings that seemed to indicate schedules or punishments. There were no names, only numbers and notes in cold, slanted handwriting. The horror had been institutionalized, tracked, measured. This was not madness in its wild form. It was disciplined evil, hidden beneath a surface of order and scripture. Even as the children were pulled into daylight, blinking and shivering, the full magnitude of what had been done to them could not be fully grasped. The damage extended beyond the physical. It had invaded their sense of self, their understanding of safety, their capacity for trust. William Sullivan was arrested at once. Margaret tried to flee but was caught before she reached the stables. Their adult children offered no resistance. In the interrogation that followed, they spoke in rehearsed phrases, invoking divine will, parental duty, and purification through suffering. They referred to the children not by name, but as subjects, souls in need of shaping or lost lambs. No remorse was evident, only frustration that their methods had been interrupted. William claimed the children were rescued from sin and were being prepared for a greater spiritual purpose. When asked about their origins, he deflected, suggesting that the world outside had abandoned them and that he had merely given them discipline where others had given them nothing. The chilling consistency of their explanations revealed a family that had built a shared reality around delusion, control, and religious extremism. Public response evolved quickly from horror to fury. Townspeople demanded justice not only for the children, but for the years of lies they had been fed. How had so many missed what was happening? Why had no one acted sooner? The revelations sparked deep divisions. Some tried to defend the Sullivans, clinging to the image they had grown to revere. Others turned their rage inward, ashamed of their silence, horrified that such darkness had thrived in the very heart of their community. The investigation widened, seeking to trace every child's origin, every connection, every potential accomplice. It became clear that the system had failed, not just law enforcement, but neighbors, clergy, and citizens. The children's voices had been drowned out by the comforting hum of social order. What began as a search for a single missing boy became a reckoning for an entire town. The basement was sealed and later destroyed, but the memories it held would haunt the region for generations. Efforts were made to care for the survivors, though many would never fully recover. Some were sent to institutions, others adopted into families, and a few vanished once more into the margins of society. Their trauma echoed in quiet gestures, distant stares, and the absence of language. The basement was more than a physical space. It was a crucible of stolen identity, stolen time, and stolen futures. The investigation had revealed what lay beneath. Not just a house, but a community unwilling to see what was hidden in plain sight. The sight of the children, when they were finally brought up from the Sullivan basement, stunned even the most hardened men among the rescue team. Gaunt faces, cheeks sunken, and eyes too large for their skeletal frames, blinked in the sudden daylight like creatures who had never seen the sun. Their skin was pale, nearly translucent in some cases, stretched tightly over their bones. Many had open sores from the metal cuffs that had dug into their ankles and wrists, the result of months, possibly years of chafing from cold iron that was never removed. Their limbs were thin and underdeveloped, betraying the effects of long-term confinement and malnutrition. Some children were unable to stand at all. Others tried to move, but collapsed under the strain. Their legs having forgotten how to carry their bodies, the psychological state of the children was perhaps even more alarming than their physical condition. Most did not speak, a few muttered incoherently in strange, fragmented patterns, half-memories, rhymes, or commands they must have heard repeated in the dark. Others covered their faces instinctively at any movement or sound, flinching as if expecting to be struck. One small girl screamed endlessly, unable to stop until her voice gave out entirely. Another child, perhaps no older than 7, kept crawling toward a wall and rubbing it as though expecting a door to open. When offered food, many hesitated, unsure whether it was a test or a trap. Several hoarded the bread or fruit given to them, hiding it under their clothing or attempting to bury it in the ground. They had not only been denied basic human care, they had been conditioned to believe it was dangerous to hope for it. The children ranged in age, the youngest no older than 4 or 5, and the eldest appearing to be in their mid-teens, though. Due to their emaciated state, accurate estimates were difficult. Some bore scars that hinted at more than just restraint. Burn marks, lash wounds, and other signs of physical abuse were observed across their bodies. There were indications of long-term neglect, but also of deliberate punishment. One child had marks around his eyes suggesting he had been blindfolded. For extended periods, another boy's fingers were gnarled from repeated fractures that had never been treated. Few were entirely mute. Not from birth, but from trauma so deep that their voices had vanished. The local physician, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of damage, described their condition as beyond what the mind of decent society can fully reckon with. The children's clothing or lack thereof added another layer of horror. Many wore only rags, and some were entirely naked, having been kept that way for ease of cleaning or dehumanization. They smelled of filth, sweat, and fear, the pungent scent clinging to them long after they were removed from the basement. Their hair was matted and crawling with lice. Open wounds had gone untreated, and several were septic. Dental conditions were horrifying, with rotten or missing teeth, swollen gums, and in some cases, oral sores likely caused by biting through wood, cloth, or even flesh during episodes of panic. One girl had gnawed her own arm raw, possibly from hunger or as a means of coping with psychological torment. Medical examiners and townspeople alike were forced to confront the truth that these children had not simply been hidden, they had been tortured. Every element of their captivity had been calculated to strip them of identity. They had no names, no personal items, no education, no touch of affection or comfort. When spoken to, some looked around in confusion, unable to grasp that words could be directed at them without pain following. Others obeyed mechanical commands instantly, as though still under the control of unseen masters. Attempts to console them with kind voices or gentle gestures were often met with recoiling. Or worse, complete disassociation, a glassy stare into nothingness, as if they had left their own bodies to escape the present moment. Some of the older children appeared to have taken on caretaker roles among the younger ones. A boy of perhaps 13 was seen wrapping his thin arms around a crying toddler, rocking back and forth even though he had no strength left to offer real comfort. Another tried to explain in broken phrases who was allowed to eat and when, as if he still feared punishment for feeding out of order. These interactions revealed a tragic hierarchy among them, a system of rules and behaviors forced upon them in order to survive. There was no play, no laughter, no evidence that any of them had experienced the kind of spontaneous joy that should define childhood. They had lived in darkness, where their world was limited to the sound of chains, the scrape of footsteps, and the ever-present awareness of pain and silence. In the days following the discovery, doctors and caregivers set up temporary facilities to begin tending to the children. Yet progress was slow. Many did not respond to treatment as expected. Their bodies resisted refeeding, reacting violently to even the softest foods. Their minds, too, did not always register the safety they had entered. Nightmares plagued their sleep. Some would wake up screaming, disoriented, crying for someone to not come down the stairs. It became clear that healing would be neither quick nor complete. These were not just injured bodies, they were fractured psyches, shaped by prolonged and deliberate cruelty that had sought to break their spirits as thoroughly as their bones. Attempts were made to identify the children, but most had no idea where they had come from. Those old enough to remember often had only fragments, vague memories of mothers, snippets of lullabies or landmarks half forgotten, without names or documents. Connecting them to missing persons cases proved incredibly difficult. Some were matched with distant relatives or recognized by scars and birthmarks from posters distributed years earlier. Others would remain unknown, their stories lost in the fog of their stolen years. What united them all was the trauma, etched into their bodies like a second skeleton, and the shared experience of having been stripped of agency, identity, and human dignity. The psychological toll extended to those who tried to help them. Nurses broke down crying in hallways. Priests questioned their faith. Even hardened lawmen, who had seen the worst of crimes, found themselves unable to sleep. Haunted by the eyes of children who had lived in the dark for so long, they had forgotten what light was. The town's perception of safety, innocence, and justice was shattered. These children were not from another land, not from some distant war-torn region. They were from their own backyards, their own streets. That reality forced everyone to reckon with how such an atrocity could occur so close to home, hidden behind the walls of a family that everyone had once revered. There were no words sufficient to explain what had been done to them. No punishment severe enough, no apology adequate. The children had not just been chained, they had been erased, transformed into ghosts while still breathing. Their survival was a miracle, but also a burden, as each would carry the weight of memory long after the chains had been removed. The world had turned away from them once, and now it was faced with the impossible task of returning what had been stolen: time, safety, trust, and the chance to grow up unafraid. The discovery of the Sullivan family's basement and the 47 children held within sent a shockwave through Virginia's social, legal, and moral frameworks, awakening a region that had long slumbered in the comfort of its traditions. Immediate rescue of the children took precedence in the early days. The aftermath quickly spiraled into something much larger, reckoning that stretched into the courts, the pulpits, the press, and the minds of citizens who had to confront the question of how such evil could flourish undisturbed in a community supposedly built on faith and decency. The incident triggered conversations that had previously only existed in whispers, dragging into the open uncomfortable truths about the failings of local authority, the fragility of child welfare systems, and the societal structures that had protected the powerful at the cost of the voiceless. At the heart of the reaction was outrage. Newspaper editorials, printed with black borders in mourning for what had transpired, condemned not only the Sullivan family, but the cultural blinders that allowed them to operate unchecked. Though the South in the 1830s was no stranger to cruelty. Slave economy, a daily reminder of institutionalized brutality, the Sullivan case was different. These were white children, many from poor or orphaned backgrounds, who had been denied even the basic recognition of humanity. Their suffering could not be written off as economic necessity or legal ambiguity. They were innocent, and they had been hidden in plain sight. That fact shattered the illusion of safety that many families clung to and created a sense of shared guilt that transcended class and creed. Public meetings were held in town squares and church halls packed with citizens, demanding to know how this could have gone unnoticed. Parents began speaking more openly about the disappearances they had once been told were isolated incidents. Mothers recalled warning their children not to wander too far from home. Some now admitted they had long suspected the Sullivan property, but were too afraid to say anything aloud. Lawmakers, many of whom had enjoyed the patronage or donations of the Sullivans, scrambled to distance themselves from the family. Investigations into local officials were launched, revealing disturbing gaps in record-keeping, ignored reports, and in some cases, blatant suppression of complaints that pointed toward the estate. The system had not just failed, it had actively protected the perpetrators through negligence, fear, or complicity. Religious leaders, too, found themselves under scrutiny. The same preachers who had lauded the Sullivans for their piety were now forced to explain how such darkness could thrive beneath a cloak of Scripture. Some gave fiery sermons denouncing evil and vowing renewal, while others retreated into silence or defensiveness. Congregations began to question the very institutions that had defined their moral compass. Was faith, if unchallenged and unexamined, merely a mask for human cruelty? Could good works and public devotion be faked so thoroughly that evil could hide behind them for years? The theological implications rippled outward, forcing communities to confront not just the Sullivans' crimes, but the very nature of sin, redemption, and the role of collective accountability. In the legislative chambers of Virginia, the Sullivan case became a catalyst for early conversations about child protection that had long been avoided. Before this, there were virtually no legal structures to safeguard children who fell outside the narrow definition of familial or property concern. Orphanages were loosely regulated, and poor children were often considered expendable labor, or charity cases, not citizens with rights. The case exposed the dangers of such indifference. Lawmakers began proposing bills that would establish clearer guidelines for child welfare, stricter licensing for orphan care, and greater oversight of private households that took in minors, though many of these reforms would take years to pass. The Sullivan incident lit the fire that fueled their creation. The horror had become undeniable, and with it came a demand for systemic change. Even the medical community responded to the incident with a newfound urgency. Physicians who examined the children began publishing reports on the psychological and physiological effects of long-term captivity, abuse, and sensory deprivation. Though the field of psychology was still in its infancy, the behaviors observed in the rescued children laid early groundwork for what would later be recognized as trauma theory. Observations about their responses to light, sound, touch, and human interaction offered stark evidence of how the environment shapes mental development. Their bodies bore the signs of more than starvation. They were maps of stress, fear, and end. The biological cost of sustained suffering. These studies, circulated through academic and medical journals, slowly began shifting the perception of child victims from burdens to be institutionalized into patients in need of care and understanding. A cultural level, the story of the Sullivan basement seeped into folklore almost instantly. Ballads were written, cautionary tales whispered to children to warn them of evil, disguised as kindness. Artists painted haunting depictions of the cellar, often exaggerating the darkness and deformity to mirror the psychological horror, rather than the literal one. Writers penned pamphlets, essays, and serialized stories that fictionalized the account, turning it into both morality play and political allegory. The incident became a symbol of hidden corruption, a Southern Gothic tragedy. That laid bare the rot beneath the polished veneer of gentility. It became a tale not just of individual depravity, but of communal failure, narrative so potent that it lingered long after the last trial had concluded. For the children who survived, the public attention was a double-edged sword. While many were finally given food, shelter, and some degree of medical attention, they also became subjects of curiosity and pity. Their trauma, so raw and visible, made it difficult for them to reintegrate into society. Some were adopted, but often more as acts of charity than affection. Others were sent to asylums or workhouses ill-equipped to handle their needs. A few disappeared altogether, either escaping the spotlight or perishing in the years that followed. Their identities remained fluid, often reduced to numbers or monikers in court transcripts and newspaper headlines. The community mourned them publicly, but struggled to support them privately. True justice remained elusive, not only because the psychological wounds could not be healed by verdicts or sentences, but because the society that had ignored their suffering now struggled to look them in the eye. The Sullivan case did not single-handedly reform the South, nor did it abolish the broader systems that enabled such abuse. But it pierced the cultural silence surrounding child suffering in a way that few events before it had managed to do. It showed that evil could be domestic, that monsters wore the masks of fathers, mothers, and neighbors, and that societal respectability could be wielded as a weapon just as effectively as chains. It forced communities to begin asking questions they had long avoided. Who watches the righteous? Who speaks for the voiceless? What rot festers beneath the rituals we mistake for virtue? The legacy of the 47 children chained beneath the earth would live on not only in memory, but in the slow, painful efforts to ensure that what was hidden once would never be hidden again.